Is a wood dial Rolex. And unlike those awful wood watches from the 2010s, these are actually quite interesting. In a previous video, I talked about how stone dials are my favorite unique dial, but there are a lot of other different options like wood and fossils, and I just wanted to cover a few of these other topics. So let's get started with wood dials. When I first saw a wood dial on a Swiss watch, I was a little bit confused and I didn't really understand what was going on. And now that I've had the chance to learn about them and appreciate them, I've really started to like them. But up until that point, the only wood watch that I knew, again, were these, mall watches in the early 2010s that were just cheap wood, and the whole thing, the bracelet, the case, everything was wood. But Rolex was doing this back in the 80s when they were a lot more adventurous. They had come out with wood dials on a lot of their popular watches like the Datejust, the Day-Date, and even the Cellini. Now, like a stone dial, each wood dial has its own unique characteristics, from the graining and the coloring, and what type of wood was actually used to create the dial. Rolex has been known to use several different types of wood in their dials, including birch, mahogany, walnut, and even sequoia. And in the early days, Rolex would actually engrave straight into the wood for their lettering, but they realized that this didn't age very well. So on the next iteration of dials, they would put a clear coat over top, and then were able to etch the letters into that clear coat to preserve the wood over time. And Rolex also made a wood finish bracelet and bezel. It was known as a bark finish. And you can see on the bezel and the bracelet center links, it looks like bark finishing. You don't really see it today, as I don't think they made it for very long, but it pairs up really well with the wood dial as it kind of continues that wood theme. It's not my favorite finishing, but again, paired up with that wood dial, it does look good. And Rolex wasn't the only brand to be doing this. Cartier also had gone into the wood dials with their Tank Organic, and Hamilton had a few examples, as well as even Accutron. Now, this is not a very popular finish today. Obviously, you don't see manufacturers of high-end watches making wood dials today, and maybe that'll change, maybe it'll come back into trend, but for now, we really only have these vintage options, and they're pretty hard to come by. Like stone dials, wood is extremely hard to work with when it's in a very thin sheet like that. Where stone is brittle, wood just doesn't have a lot of structural integrity, and it's very easy to break the dials. They also don't last very long. When you're servicing these, it can be very hard to maintain and preserve these dials over a long period of time. Now, next is my favorite coral dials, and they're exactly like they sound. They're literally pieces of coral that have been cut and shaped into dials, and they have the most beautiful colors and depth and texture that only natural materials could produce. And when they say coral, they don't mean coral like on a reef, they mean coral stone, which is a fossilized version of coral and shells and other organisms and calciferous algae that are on the floor of the ocean. They get compacted and fossilized together into a stone. Now, the three main color variations that you'll see, especially on the Rolex coral dials, are the classic coral red. They also have a kiwi, and then a light blue version as well. Now, obviously, these are considered a stone dial because they are a fossilized stone, but I didn't have enough time to cover this in the other video, so I wanted to spend some time talking about them here. Now, these dials are extremely rare, with very few of them being made in the first place, and like stone dials, they're quite brittle, hard to work with, and even harder to service now. So any of the remaining examples are often left cracked or broken, and that just shows that there are even fewer of these left. So they are very, very valuable and often command quite a high price on the secondary markets or at auction. And Rolex only made them for a short time back in the 1980s, so the number of them is only going to continue to go down. And their limited manufacturing numbers were due to the fact that Rolex was struggling to produce them. Even though they had become proficient in creating these stone dials, these coral stone dials proved to be even more challenging due to their brittleness. Now, unfortunately, there are some very good fake dials out on the market these days. Because there's a lot of demand and there's a high price point being commanded for these coral dials specifically, and a lot of just stone dials in general, there's incentive for people to produce really good fake dials. And as vintage collectors and new collectors come into the market, that demand just continues to go up and up as the supply for these coral dials specifically continues to go down. So if you are interested in buying any of these watches, you have to be very, very careful about the authenticity of the watch. And finally, we have fossil dials. And no, not those fossil watches. I'm talking about real prehistoric fossils. Now, obviously, these aren't like giant T-Rex bones or anything. These are more like crinoids and other marine life and invertebrates that can be found at the bottom of the ocean that have been compacted into rocks and formed into fossils. Now, these aren't as widespread or commonly made or known even as a lot of the main hardstone dials, and that's not to say that they aren't highly sought after. In fact, collectors will pay top dollar for these. Because there aren't a lot of examples of them, the people who appreciate them really appreciate them, and they will pay top dollar to get a good example of a fossil dial. And again, because of this brittleness, it's the same story. They didn't produce that many to begin with, and now there are even less available on the market because when they get serviced or just over time, they begin to break and crack, and so there's not a lot of prime examples left. And people who care about fossils will pay big money to get these. Now, we don't really see a lot of fossil dials today. In fact, we really don't see any of them. But with the revival of the stone dial trend, like we talked about in a previous video, there could be an opportunity for a really brave brand to stand up and take on this challenge and hopefully be able to produce some really amazing fossil dials at scale, and not only in an economically viable way, but in a manufacturing process that allows them to last and not be so brittle over time. But I have a feeling, like the other dials, there's just a real manufacturing challenge with the brittleness of these stone dials, and I think it would take a lot for a brand to want to do this again. But we'll see how long this stone dial trend continues, and if brands start to get desperate enough to stand out and be different, maybe we'll start to see some fossil dials again. And the final dial type, like the other ones, is just a variation of a hardstone dial, and it's known as sugilite. This is a relatively rare silica-based mineral that comes in many different color variations, but it's most popularized for its dark purple hues, and that's what you'll see it on watches in. And if hardstone dials themselves weren't rare enough, sugilite is considered rare even amongst stone dials. I only know of it really being used on a Lady Datejust by Rolex, but while doing some research for this video, I found that Van Cleef actually used sugilite in a recent planetarium watch that is just wild. Now, they aren't using sugilite on the whole dial, they just used a little bit to represent one of the planets on the dial. And this is a bit off topic, but I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with this watch because it is wild. It retails for around 300,000 USD, and it's a working planetarium, which means that each planet is on its own rotating disc that travels around the watch in a real-life rotation. I just wanted to finish off by saying that we're starting to see the popularity and the revival of the stone dial trend, and I think it's going to continue to get more and more popular, and we're going to see brands at all levels of the market from entry to top tier producing stone dial watches. And when that happens, brands are going to have to look at what's next and how are they going to keep their competitive and creative edge. And I think that dial materials like potentially wood or fossil could be the next thing for brands to kind of stand out and keep their market share. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.